Right, guys, get.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Leanne Langer. I'm OpenComp's head of customer experience. Big welcome to all of those who are listening in today. And thank you so much for being a part of our High Growth Matters community, where our goal is your compensation success. You're all here today for our AMA. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce today's topic, which is delivering a compelling candidate experience. And I'm here along with our esteemed experts, Ryan Hatcher and Nick Vossler, our awesome recruiters here at OpenComp. Ryan, would you start off by introducing yourself?
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. I'm Ryan. I'm one of the senior recruiters here at OpenComp. I joined pretty recently back in December, and prior was working at Connery Consulting for about 3 years as a recruiting consultant there. And then here at OpenComp, I work with our product and engineering teams primarily.
Awesome. Thank you.
And
all right, Nick.
Yep. Hello, everyone. I'm Nick Vossler, and I've much more recently been converted over from Connery in the past month to a full-time role here at OpenComp. I lead the go-to-market efforts and assist where I can on the engineering side, since it's a hot market for that currently.
Thank you. And this is our first panel that we've done for these AMAs. So we're going to learn our flow and, go back and forth. So thank you guys so much for being with us.
Happy to be here.
All right. So like a broken record, we keep saying and hearing and also obviously experiencing in our day-to-day that the hiring market is super hot. It's competitive. It's also really difficult to navigate for folks. So from your perspective, can you give us an idea about what you guys are seeing out there on the front lines every day as to what is making it so difficult?
Yeah,
Ryan, why don't we start with you?
Okay, yeah, I'll go first. Yeah, that doesn't even begin to describe it. It is definitely a wild market right now. I think some of the things that I love bringing up when this comes up is just that there is a lot more focus on what the companies are providing environmentally as well. We have remote work taking more of a front seat. We have work-life balance taking on new meaning while still retaining a team culture. That's a really important one. And then there's just also the sheer number of employers right now. It's very much an insane market. When you talk to candidates, they're getting outreach from just much higher volume than they've even seen in the past. And then lastly, we're seeing competition across the country. You're no longer competing on purely like a localized level. You're now competing with a small, well-funded startup that's remote completely. And you might not have been competing with them prior. So it's just the market has changed.
You mentioned something interesting, which I don't think has come up before, but the sheer number of applicants is increasing. So that is an interesting point of view as well. Nick, what do you have to add?
Yeah, piggybacking off of what Ryan said, these candidates in a candidate-driven market are really given so many different opportunities that they're really getting into granular details about every single opportunity that they're identifying, much more so than before when it was more of an employer-driven market. So that change has definitely created a lot of competition, like Ryan mentioned. That has also increased the velocity of a lot of hiring processes out there. We've seen, a lot of candidates that we've spoken with are already holding a couple offers. They have a room to be picky, and it's definitely creating a much more challenging hiring environment.
And what are you hearing from the candidates' perspective? What do they say about the hiring market that they are participating in?
I actually have a great example. I just spoke with someone about 40 minutes ago that described it as overwhelming. Albeit this was not a fairly typical, actually, like software engineer coming out of maybe about 3 years of experience, and not expressly like entry level, not quite at the senior level. So this is one of his earlier job searches still in his career, but still overwhelming, I think describes it best.
100%. It goes across a lot of different roles. There's a lot of recruiters reaching out to every single candidate that's out there because they have a number of jobs to fill. And really the time it takes to interview with all of them is almost a second job to a lot of these candidates. So carving out that time is it's important to put your best foot forward really quickly so that they consider you as somebody worth talking to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Nick, since you just weighed in, we'll start out with you for this question, but are you finding that cash is king in this market?
I mean, it's always going to be a really important piece, right? Got to pay the bills every month to a certain degree, but I don't think it's necessarily king because there's, like I said, there's a lot more demand into finding the right environment that matches exactly where they want to be going with their career. Things like Ryan mentioned, work from home capabilities. What is your return to office plan? Tell me about the growth projection of the company. With this candidate-driven market, there's a lot more space for these candidates to be pickier about what is, where their next spot is going to be. So, understanding the role in more detail, the mission, and being able to convey that transparently has gotten even more critical.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if I can back off what Nick said there, I think the transparency piece is really key here these days, especially. I mean, when you think compensation is always going to be an important driver of any candidate's decision, sure. But especially now when there's an unknown around a company's compensation because of the number of companies and opportunities that they have available to them, it lends itself to a much higher withdrawal rate from those candidates. They have no real reason to continue on a process where there's an unknown if they have 5 other companies that have been upfront with them in some capacity. So I think transparency around it is king right now, rather than necessarily just the comp itself. Yeah.
I love that. Transparency is king. Do you think that candidates have a good sense of how to compare multiple offers?
Nick, do you want to go first?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think there's elements of both yes and no. In this market, candidates are asking for more details about a role than an employer-driven market, right? Putting transparency at a higher priority, but I think there's points where they understand what exactly is involved in the compensation piece to a degree, but kind of being able to take into account the future value of certain pieces like your equity, or how does that compare against what the value of a sign-on bonus. I feel occasionally there could be more education there, and helping to convey that certainly helps in bringing more people on board.
We're never short on the need for education, right?
No.
Ryan, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I think there is one thing that I've kind of been thinking about in terms of candidates when they look at their offers. I find a high tendency for candidates to look at, let me say there's 2 camps. I do think there are candidates who evaluate all the different components individually. I personally think that is the preferred way to do things, but then there are a lot of candidates out there who will kind of look at every component of their offer as though it exists in one singular bucket. And a lot of times I think that gives a skewed perspective of things like their actual sustainable income over their employment at that company, as well as like how their income will shift between different years. A very good example of this would be companies that give very, very large year 1 sign-on bonuses, which is actually fairly common still, at least in the technical market, especially for like engineering positions. And you see like a FANG company, for instance, giving very, very, very high sign-ons lately in the upwards of 50 to, I've even seen 100K for, not quite entry level, but basically like level 2 up to senior level engineers. And, when you're evaluating your income over the course of multiple years and you're seeing this very large lump sum year 1, it tends to drive your thinking around your compensation a little differently. But then you get to year 2 and you realize, wow, here's where my income actually is this year. And you see some attrition that comes out of that. You see just some also like, personal disengagement from the companies. So like I've chatted with candidates who are coming out of that kind of like year 1 into that year 2 slump. Also, sometimes that's when your equity isn't quite vesting as much as it might be with some companies that do like backloaded equity vesting. So there's just like some structures in how comp is handled today that I think give this false impression of where your compensation actually is and how that'll impact your life. And I think some candidates are starting to recognize that and looking at like, how is my life going to change based on these different packages versus, this number higher, this number better, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So sort of this initial package appears really shiny because it's overinflated in that year 1. But from a candidate's perspective, they need to understand what is happening beyond year 2, year 3, or 4. And obviously, from a company's perspective, we want to maintain, the employment relationship and have retention for as long as we possibly can for all the investment that we're making, not just cash and equity, but resources and education and transition time. Like all of this is so important, for bringing on a candidate, and to keep in mind as we think about the spend associated with hiring.
Definitely.
So what are the most common questions that you get from candidates regarding their offers?
I have a feeling we'll have similar answers
Yeah.
here. Let me think. Can this offer move?
Yep.
And that's probably the big one. And it's not always coming with a demand, I'll say. Sometimes it's just actually probing. I think a lot of candidates, don't know maybe always where they can ask for more and whether like they should just ask to see what happens. And I think so a lot of times we get that question just kind of on the hope, but it's not always necessarily a driver of their final decision. Though it definitely is. I think also the other one that I hear a lot is, what is the justification of the leveling that went into this offer? People want to understand how your feedback directly correlates to the decision. And that is not always clear. That's not something that's always been clear in the organizations I've been a part of. And I think a lot of recruiters will say the same. Like it often can, that's a section that can be improved upon.
Yeah, that leveling matrix there is so critical. Making sure you have real specific criteria to, justify the leveling in that sense, right? And to kind of just piggyback off what Ryan said, number one question is far and away, do we have any room? Is there any flexibility to go up on this? And yeah, sometimes it's primarily probing, but I've also seen a lot of candidates recently ask for flexibility as it relates to start dates. I think the last at least 5 hires I've had have asked for something well over a month and a half out. And I know there's sometimes hiring leaders are a little hesitant to do that because, maybe that signifies, are they going to continue interviewing other places? Or are they just going to use that offer to kind of test the market a bit? But I think that flexibility has been an extremely common request recently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, no, I was just going to reiterate, like we do see that a lot more. I've always kind of assumed that it was related to higher rates of burnout that are associated with like work from home, remote working, people maybe not being used to that still, and then companies not adapting quite well to that model. And then that causing employee attrition and those employees wanting a gap before they start a new role.
Mm-hmm. I love that you guys also both touched on leveling, like the job leveling calibration. So extremely important so that these hires know where their expected, competency is coming into this organization. And it also indicates what their trajectory is for career development. And so I love seeing that candidates are asking more questions around that, as it puts pressure on companies to get more scientific and more clear as to how we are leveling candidates and employees in general. And then you guys also mentioned negotiation. So I want to throw this in really quick, but are you still seeing negotiation as a common part of the recruiting process, or are you seeing the opportunity for negotiate, at least from like a company's philosophy perspective? Like we come out with, the best and final offer, we do not negotiate. Is that position becoming more common?
That's a good question.
I mean, I think you're going to have to address it because I think, like we said earlier, right? These candidates know what type of market it is. They're not hesitating to start a negotiation if that's helping with that. Yeah. I think either way you approach that, you should be ready for candidates to be asking for a negotiation process.
Yep, that's fair.
I personally feel not allowing for that negotiation is going to shoot you in the foot still more than it's not. It's very, very hard to time it right where your offer is the best offer coming at the right time in that candidate's offers that they're receiving for it to land well and like impact their final decision without being able to adjust it any further. Because inevitably still we do see a lot of late stage escalations in offers. Companies are coming back with improved offers after their initial offer still. And so having the flexibility to work around that while still remaining within your own comp philosophy is still pretty important. Would love a world where we could reduce that more, but I think just currently it's not in that place yet.
Got it. And just, in regards to compensation, how and when during the interview process do you guys start introducing job candidates to the comp ranges for the role?
Right away.
Yeah, pretty quickly. First call.
Yeah, one thing we're doing here at OpenComp that's different is we are introduce that right away. We want to the point where we're adding it in our messaging. We are having that conversation from the first recruiter screen. Every touch point that we, the recruiters, are having with our, especially at least on my side with our engineering candidates, I'm giving them a sense that increasingly gets closer and closer to their exact compensation package so that they're very aware of where that will land. Generally, by the time they've completed like the technical screen with us, they generally have an idea of pretty much exactly where that initial offer will land. I'm pretty clear with them what can be done after to improve that offer if there are circumstances that require that. But they have a very clear idea of where our package will land going into even from mid stages of our process.
This kind of just goes back to our point earlier in the conversation about, that transparency up front is kind of what keeps them engaged in your process, right? I think that, if you're not bringing it up in that first call, you're running the risk of them just clipping you from the group of maybe 10, 12 companies they're interviewing with. So it is important to start right out of the gate with it.
I think also one more point is just with companies without a lot of brand recognition, we're increasingly seeing a lot of value in adding it in our messaging as well. Like, and where we have the capacity to do that and the clear ranges outlined for that role to do so, it is adding a lot of value because it demonstrates our competitiveness, and that's sometimes hard to assume when you don't have as much information on an earlier stage startup.
Yeah. And I guess just piggybacking on the topic of introducing as much information as you can early on to pique the candidate's interest. Do you ever hear feedback from job candidates on job descriptions themselves, right? Like being the first point of discovery of an organization or of a company, what are things that companies can do to make that job description stand out?
I'm happy to jump in here.
Yeah.
So I don't always get a lot of explicit feedback on the job description from candidates themselves. I do, however, feel that it's important that companies recognize, and this is something that I personally believe around the job description side, that there is an inherent bias in job descriptions. So I think it's very important that companies be very aware of how they are actually describing the requirements of their role. This becomes increasingly more relevant when you are looking at hiring a diverse pool of talent, especially if you are looking at kind of like gender diversity lines as one of the key areas you want to focus on. I think, this became popularized with I think when Lean came out by Sheryl Sandberg, but there was this idea of that, and it became like really popular at the time, like women only apply to a role if they feel they connect with 100% of the job requirements. Men only apply if they feel they connect with 60%. Now, after it kind of came out that was anecdotal, that wasn't actually necessarily based on data, but a lot of discussions kind of came from that. And LinkedIn recently released a lot of its information on candidates and how they apply to jobs. And one of the key findings that they had was that women on average apply to less positions. And it could just be that they are applying to positions they feel that they have a safer bet of getting an acceptance from. So in that way, kind of pulling it back, you need to ensure that your job descriptions are not restrictive because they are that first engagement touch point that a candidate might have with your company if they're coming in through a passive channel. So I just think there is work companies could do on being more cognizant of that. And I also, personally, just because you don't see a lot of feedback on the content of the job description itself, I also think that you should prioritize getting the major touch points around your company culture, around major selling points around your organization or brand in there as well, so that that's what they're really focusing on, and it becomes less of a gatekeeping tool and more of a engagement and tool to drive excitement in your company.
Definitely agree with that. And so with that, hot hiring market, you differentiate as much as you can from the job description. You try to pique their interest. How do companies, or how do you demonstrate to your candidates your interest in them? What do you do that helps set you and your conversations apart?
I mean, I think there's there's a lot that we do here that I think it's particularly helpful for, and it's not necessarily applicable to every company out there. For example, we keep them engaged throughout the process with, for example, we can bring in our CEO currently on certain calls to get their interest. What do I do personally is I use my soft skills to continue the enthusiasm that might come from the initial outreach. I tell them, I first listen to why they're even on the phone with me and use that to kind of deliver the value that they're looking for in that job, right? What is the ideal next landing spot for them? And just making sure that your role actually does align with what motivates them to get, to do the best, to reach their best performance.
Mm-hmm. Listening is very important.
Yes.
I was going to just echo that too. Getting your ELT members highly engaged, and then providing context where you can to your ELT members and hiring managers that are engaged in that that post-interview process of communicating with candidates. If you can get them to really understand the pain points that you pulled out of that candidate, those candidate conversations prior, and get them to directly address those in those calls, that goes so far. Not only actually, there's also this other fringe benefit, right? You're getting your own team engaged in that candidate and interested in that candidate as well. And I think we all know, any kind of hiring decision, there are two sides of it. You need to get that candidate interested, but sometimes it's just as much work getting your team as interested and excited, and you want that excitement coming from them. So it's a good way to build that on both sides and kind of in one way. And really getting them to address those exact pain points shows that candidate that your team was listening. And it's crazy. People like to be heard. So
weird.
Yeah, weird. Who would have thought?
I mean, you guys are touching on some really human aspects of this process, right? I feel like it's very easy to make this very mechanical and robotic. I feel like these human factors really help differentiate. So truly getting to know your candidate, understanding their wants, their needs, where they're coming from, what they're looking for, being super transparent and honest about where the company is at in terms of scale and stage of growth and what is expected in this role, and essentially playing matchmaker. Is this right? Is this not? And so looking at it from a more human perspective versus a human quota driven sort of perspective, I think goes a long way. Let's see. So as we're getting close to end of time, just a couple of last questions. Ryan, this one's for you, but especially we have a hot talent market for our technical and our engineering hires. How do you differentiate your recruiting process for those folks?
Yeah, no, this is so key right now, especially for earlier stage startups. One of the biggest things we do is we reduced as much as we feasibly could our process down to as few steps as possible. We still want them engaging with the relevant team members that they'll partner and work closely with, but as few rounds as possible while still getting effective and reasonable signal to make a hiring decision was kind of our core reasoning there. Especially when you look at the market today, you have companies, especially big tech FANG companies, especially, that are doing 8 to 9 rounds. Their final interviews are at minimum 4 to 5 rounds, each one 45 minutes to an hour. And often, and this is I think the part that I think a lot of people know, but for whatever reason doesn't get actioned, is many candidates don't feel like a lot of those rounds are incredibly relevant to the day-to-day of their role. And so that's the other key thing that we try to focus on in our process, reducing it down, but making each round directly relevant to what that candidate is going to be doing and engaging with in their day-to-day and with that team. So to that end, what we've done is our technical screens actually use real world problems that our team has dealt with in the area of the tech stack that candidate will be engaging with. So our front-end candidates engage on an actual front-end problem. Our back-end candidates engage on actual back-end and infrastructure and SQL problems. So we really align our process to be more realistic and real world related, which surprisingly does not happen across the board. And that eats at candidates, especially when you have candidates who are engaging with a minimum 3 companies, but upwards of 7 to 10 processes at once. And they have to schedule, a few of these massive on-sites or remote on-sites as they are now. It burns them out incredibly. People take full months off to interview sometimes because of this. And, having been on the other side of that, having run some of those 5-stage interviews, they don't always come out with clear-cut decisions. It's not that process is perfected and suddenly every candidate coming through that, it's yes, here's our clear-cut decision on the feedback of this candidate. They're still having the same challenges that we are with our reduced process. So I think just being very cognizant of what you're putting your candidates through and making sure that it's directly relevant to what they're actually need to be assessed for and what they're going to do. And ideally make them feel that connection, be like, this is a problem that we've worked with. Like, don't try not to keep like the interview process in a black box where there's that disengagement from what it'll look like when they work for us.
Love all of that. Again, going back to being human and being respectful of everybody's time who's involved. All right, last question. So Nick, we'll start with you, and then Ryan, we'll let you close this out, okay? But let's get a little personal. Share with us a time when one of your job candidates gave positive feedback about the recruiting process. What was that feedback? Why was it a compelling candidate experience for them? And why is it something that was meaningful for you as well?
Yeah, pretty recently actually. Filled a director level role here at OpenComp. I think it was a really good example of just providing a white glove experience. The feedback that I received came from the ELT, who also communicated with him, right, saying Nick was very attentive, really replied quick, really felt that person-to-person connection. And I think there were times even where it's okay to be vulnerable and show a human side. We would call every now and then just to update on certain questions throughout the process. I think I spoke with this candidate on the phone but north of 20 times throughout the process. It's kind of a high level role, but he would call me when he just had a random question, things like that. And even if I was in the middle of something, it's not bad to share a little bit of personality, show what you're up to. I was like in the middle of a wedding one time when he called me, but it was refreshing to hear that the attention to time to response, the attention to detail, and just having that personable connection really paid off, got us a great candidate, great hire. And it was impactful to me because it was one of my definitely an important role for the company and one of my first ones here.
Awesome. Thank you. Ryan.
Yeah, I'm gonna use an example from here at OpenComp as well. One of our senior PMs the other day, who I was the recruiter hiring her. She messaged me on Slack basically saying how she was bragging to her husband about me and the recruiting process and how transparent it was. And I think that's just the theme in most of the times I've gotten positive feedback from candidates. It always revolves around this idea of like, you were so much more transparent than other recruiters I've talked to, or wow, thank you for giving me like clarity and transparency throughout the process. That was so refreshing. Like, that's what I hear a lot whenever that's the feedback I get. It's like, it was very refreshing. It was so nice to kind of get this level of transparency back. So I think, when it comes down to it, it's just being very, very transparent with your candidates and just being willing to kind of always, as Nick said, like, talk through anything with that same level of like forthcoming transparency where you can.
Love this. You guys, thank you so much. This was absolutely fantastic. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing your expertise. Folks, both Ryan and Nick are in the community, so feel free to find them. But thank you all so much for your time, and we'll talk to you again next week. Bye, y'all.
Bye, everyone.
Yep.